Have you ever wondered just how accurate your electronic reloading scale really is? Well, if so, you're not going to want to miss this special edition of Extreme Reloading. Don't go away. Have you ever wondered how accurate your scale is? Now, this is one of my first scales. Actually, this is my first electronic scale. This is an RCBS PowderPro electronic scale. It's quite impressive for its day. It was excellent. I kept it because it's actually easy for me to weigh bullets and these sorts of things on this kind of standalone scale relative to the ChargeMaster over here, which is a much newer scale. But when I transitioned from this one to this one a number of years ago, I noticed that as I was loading some 220 Swift cases, that it seemed like it was giving me some different velocities out at the range. Then I started noticing it looked like the cases seemed to be a little bit more full or less full. I don't remember which direction it was when I was using this one. So I started making some comparisons between the two. And I'm still not convinced that, let's say, 42 grains here is exactly the same as 42 grains there. Well, it really all comes down to how they're calibrated. And the way that we calibrate this one is very similar to how we calibrate that one, but it's all done with these different weights. Here we have a 50-gram weight, and it's accompanied by a 20-gram weight. The ChargeMaster gives you two 50-gram weights. But that then makes a person wonder, how accurate are these weights themselves? Both of these scales are supposed to be accurate to a tenth of a grain. And I believe that they are. But what I started wondering about is how good are these calibration weights? So I bought a few extra weights, bought a couple extra 50-gram weights. I bought a set later on of some additional weights. And then I started learning more about the classes of weights, the quality of those weights themselves, and how ASTM rates the quality of the weights and so on. And what I wanted to do is to make sure that I had a weight of sufficient quality that was far better than the capabilities of either of these two scales. So what I ended up doing is I purchased a pretty good, very high quality weight here that's going to do the trick for us. And it is a Class 3, ASTM Class 3 50-gram weight. And these are accurate to 6/10 of a milligram, far below what either of these scales could measure. So even if there is a slight error in something like this, it'll never be detected by either of those scales. See what I mean? So 50 grams is equal to 771.6 grains. Actually, obviously, 771.617 keeps going on and on and on. So if I take this 50-gram weight right here, and I weigh it there, it should weigh at 771.6 grains. But that doesn't. What does it weigh over here? So that's interesting. The calibration weight is correct, but it's not calibrating correctly over here. Perhaps I re-zero it. And it was calibrated just a little while ago. That's so important to do each time that you start a powder charging session. Well, let's see how these 50-gram weights stack up. 2/10 of a grain difference here. Perfect. What about the second one? Perfect. Still off by 2/10. Now let's try this very nice ASTM weight. There we go, it has settled in. So I feel very confident that our ChargeMaster is doing a beautiful job, but I'm worried about this one, the old PowderPro. Let's go ahead and recalibrate this one. And now let's test our ASTM Class 3 weight once again. And it's still off by 1/10 of a grain. So we're already seeing a difference in this old scale, and that's really bothersome. But what I want to do now is I want to see if any of these drift. Notice here that this one has now moved to 771.7, as that has sat on there for a little while. Looks good again. So I'm going to give these a good, thorough test. You'll notice that we started running this experiment on a Saturday evening at about 8 p.m. I'm going to let both of these continue to run for 2 full days, 48 hours. I'm not going to zero them or tear them again, and we're going to see how much they have moved in that time period. I'll be right back. All right, as you see, we made it 2 full days without the power going off to any of these. And we have quite a bit of drift on the old PowderPro. In fact, it's not as bad as it looked about a day ago. About 24 hours into it, I had about a 1.2, 1.3 grain difference or of drift, and always in the negative direction, by the way. I noticed that it was starting to come down today, so I got a little footage real quick of that. And as I would walk past both of these different scales, I would check them throughout the days. And this one never moved. This is the ChargeMaster, and it has sat nice and steady at 0.0, perfectly zeroed, perfectly tared during the entire 24-hour period. So definitely this gets the thumbs up, as it did so well in that way. Now, one of the additional things I want to do is give it this test once again with our official weight. This is a 50 gram weight, and it should read 771.6 grains precisely on the ChargeMaster. Now let's come over here. Yeah, that's our difference right there, 770.9. That gives us our, well, right now, our 7/10 of a grain difference. Let's remove this for the time being. Let's tare it one more time, or zero it. Now we're at a stable 0. Notice that the little dot is not blinking. Let's go back and see what it's reading. And it's still not reading 771.6. It's still off. So it'd be pretty easy to say, well, who cares? But we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about why we should care, and why, actually, if you have one of these or are using one of these, you can still create some very accurate, very precise ammunition. So let's get these turned off and then do a little recap about what we've learned right here. Well, I've noticed that these scales, and particularly the PowderMaster Pro, are quite sensitive to vibration, interference, those sorts of things. So I don't know if you noticed it, but I have a line conditioner that I put on, and I always use whenever I'm using my electronic powder scales. And this line conditioner is from APC. And that line conditioner does seem to help. In fact, there might have been some interference from the ChargeMaster being picked up by the PowderMaster Pro, causing it to have a little bit of problem. But nonetheless, what we're seeing is that that second generation of electronic powder scales, the ChargeMaster, is in fact a better unit, a better way of dispensing precisely that powder charge. Now, if a person used the PowderMaster Pro to develop a load, that's just perfectly fine, and I have created some fantastic loads using my PowderMaster Pro, the first generation of electronic powder scales that I've ever owned, and I think the first one that RCBS ever came out with. The only thing to consider, though, is if you move from one type of powder scale to a second powder scale, accuracy of one charge weighed on a second scale may not really be exactly the same. And so what is wise to do is to very carefully check those two scales against one another if you can. And if you can't, you might want to work up the load once again with that new scale. Now, we're not seeing two tremendously different values in or between these two scales, the PowderMaster and the ChargeMaster. We're seeing differences in about 1/10 or maybe a couple tenths of a grain. Relatively speaking, the PowderMaster is super accurate within what it's doing on its own, and the ChargeMaster is accurate within what it is weighing on its own. So we've just looked at what I'm calling Gen 1 and Gen 2 electronic powder scales from RCBS. Well, there's a new kid on the block, and I'm calling it the Gen 3 powder scale, and it is the MatchMaster that came out from RCBS a little bit less than a year ago, if I'm correct, and I finally got one of these. And what you'll notice with this one is its claim that it is accurate to 4/100ths of a grain. And it's very fast. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to compare the ChargeMaster against the MatchMaster. I'll be throwing some pistol loads using unique powder, and we'll see which one can dispense 10 rounds fastest. Today I'm loading some 90 grain 9mm bullets and using 5.8 grains of unique powder. This is an excellent powder. I like to use it for pretty much all my pistol loads. And I'm using obviously my ChargeMaster electronic powder dispenser. And I'll be doing a comparison on its speed. There we go, 5.8 grains. Okay, here is the 5.8 grains that we just threw from the ChargeMaster. I'm going to add this load or this charge to the MatchMaster's pan and see what it reads. Now this charge is agreeing that it's 5.8 grains. Okay, now let's do this test in the opposite direction. Let's throw 5.8 grains here in the MatchMaster and then check to see what the ChargeMaster says the same load is, or the same charge is. Certainly seems like the MatchMaster is quite a bit faster. 5.8 grains. By the way, I'm using powder speed setting 4, which is the fastest. And I'll add this now to the pan that I'm using for the ChargeMaster and check it. 5.8. I like to do this sort of test whenever I'm changing scales because one scale may very consistently tell you it's 5.8 grains or 20.0 grains or whatever you're throwing. And you may work up a load using that very specific powder charge. And then if we would move over to another scale where that charge is not really quite as precise or it's a little bit different, and as you can see here, we're moving kind of up in the world from a scale that's pretty darn good to a scale that's even more precise. And what I mean is this is a pretty darn good scale here, the ChargeMaster system, but the MatchMaster is even more precise. Now this whole thing becomes even more important if you are using or shooting a rather hot load. And it's possible then, of course, that when you change scales, that the new scale may actually allow you to throw an even hotter charge, and you don't want that, right? This is not that hot of a charge, and for these 90 grain spear gold dots, I've actually shot it all the way through a full 6 grains of powder, but I prefer and I want to use 5.8 grains for a couple of very good reasons. Looks like it's a little bit more consistent and should actually perform better on target. Now earlier I said that it certainly seems like the new MatchMaster is quite a bit faster than the older ChargeMaster. And let's have a little bit of fun and kind of put these two to the test simultaneously. So here's my test. I'm going to run both of these scales simultaneously until one of them charges 10 cases. I'm then going to stop and see what the difference is. I'll try to set this up so they both start at the exact same time. Wow. Okay, the MatchMaster just finished up 10, and right after it finished up its 10th, the ChargeMaster finished up its 7th. Well, the new MatchMaster takes the win, completing 10 correct powder charges in 5 minutes and 48 seconds, or roughly 1 correct powder charge every 54 seconds, or 1 minute. Now, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but early on there were a couple of errors on the part of the MatchMaster, and I had to put that powder charge back into the hopper and let it run it again. So it looked like the ChargeMaster might catch up, and perhaps slow and steady wins the race might have been the mantra for the ChargeMaster. But once the MatchMaster got in the groove, it just kind of took off and easily won our little competition. I guess it's not too surprising. Quite a bit newer technology, more precise, faster, and MatchMaster is definitely a better powder scale, but it of course has a much higher price tag. And if you already have a ChargeMaster, that may not be sufficient for you to say, I'm going to invest in the MatchMaster. Now we've got a couple more videos coming up where we're going to work with the MatchMaster again and some of the more difficult powders. And specifically I'm talking about some of these extruded cylindrical or stick type powders like RL15. That's not too terribly difficult of a powder to meter through properly. But then we're also going to look at Varget. And Varget for me has been a real bane for the ChargeMaster. It's a difficult powder to meter properly. We're going to give it a test with the new MatchMaster. Thanks for watching.